July 4th, 1942. On this date, 6 American crews flying A-20 Boston bombers under British markings made the widely publicized official combat debut of the United States Air Corps in Europe. They followed a first strike by the same squadron on June 29th. The twin-engine bombers raced at 50 feet over the North Sea toward German airfields in Holland. In the lead element, Bombardier Marshal Draper crouched in the plexiglass nose of his A-20, a plane built for speed, not armor. Heavy flak erupted from the coast, and the formation broke apart under a wall of tracer fire. Draper's pilot, Lieutenant Lorla, lost control, and the A-20 slammed into the North Sea. Draper awoke underwater, tangled in his parachute harness, struggling to the surface. He swam ashore on the Dutch coast, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, and was taken prisoner by German soldiers. He became the first 8th Air Force prisoner of war. 6 weeks later, on August 17, 1942, 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 97th Bomb Group took off from England in broad daylight. Their target, the marshalling yards at Rouen, France. This was the first all-American heavy bomber mission, the test of a doctrine the British said would fail. The bombers flew in tight formation at 23,000 feet with clear skies and little opposition. They dropped their bombs on the railroad yards and returned home without loss. General Ira Eaker, watching from a B-17, called it a success. The British congratulated the Americans, but the raid revealed what the Luftwaffe already suspected. The fortresses had weak forward firepower, and their gunners had never fired a 50 caliber machine gun from a B-17 before arriving in England. The concept of daylight precision bombing had taken its first step into the fire, but the real test was still ahead. The winter of 1943 descended on England like a closing fist. For the men of the 8th Air Force, the early optimism of the Rouen raid had long since evaporated. At Molesworth, Captain Billy Southworth and his crew of the 303rd Bomb Group prepared for another mission in their B-17F Bad Check. Southworth, the son of the St. Louis Cardinals manager, had grown up on baseball diamonds, not battlefields. But now he led 10 men into the frozen sky above German-occupied France. On January 3rd, the target was St. Nazaire, a U-boat base ringed with flak batteries. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Yellow-nosed Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts hit the formation from every angle, concentrating their head-on attacks where the B-17's defenses were weakest. Bad Check shuddered as 20-millimeter cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. 5 aircraft from the 303rd did not return. The navigator watched the falling fortresses in stunned silence. He began to lose weight, lose sleep, lose his grip on the reality of survival. The waist gunner recalled the scene as pure shock. He saw Major Sheridan's plane take a direct hit and disintegrate, pieces of it tearing holes in his own aircraft. The 10 empty bunks that night at Molesworth told a story no briefing could convey. For the navigator, the accumulation of loss became unbearable. He began to feel responsible for every death, every plane that failed to return. The flight surgeon grounded him and sent him to the hospital. The war had claimed its first casualty of the spirit from Southworth's crew. On February 26, the 44th Bomb Group prepared for a maximum effort against Bremen. Howard Adams, a West Pointer flying the B-24 Maisie, led his element into the sky. Also aboard was Robert Post, a 25-year-old reporter from the New York Times, eager to document the air war firsthand. The plan called for the liberators to fly high above the B-17s, but prop wash and weather scattered the formation. Over the North Sea, the Luftwaffe struck. German fighters hit the isolated B-24s with brutal efficiency. Maisie was caught low and alone, separated from the pack. Adams fought to regain altitude, but the enemy swarmed from all sides. Engines 3 and 4 caught fire. The wing tanks exploded. Navigator Wayne Gocke woke up falling through space, his parachute barely opening in time. He was the only officer to survive. Adams and Robert Post were killed, the first American journalists to die on an 8th Air Force mission. 5 liberators went down that day, taking 45 men with them. The Bremen disaster exposed a truth the High Command could no longer ignore. The bombers could not defend themselves alone. P-47 Thunderbolts had begun arriving in England, but their range was pitifully short. They could escort the bombers to the coast of Holland and no farther. Beyond that point, the Luftwaffe waited in strength. The men of the 44th buried their dead and counted their losses. The mighty 8th was bleeding out, one mission at a time. By June, the 56th Fighter Group was operational with the new P-47 Thunderbolt. Among its pilots was Robert Johnson, a stocky 23-year-old from Oklahoma who had learned to fly by washing planes at his local airport. The Thunderbolt was a brute of a machine, 7 tons of steel and engine, and it handled like a truck, but it could dive like a meteor. On June 13th, Johnson spotted 12 Focke-Wulfs passing below his formation. He broke discipline, dove on them, and shot down the German leader in his first real pass. Johnson's confidence nearly killed him. Days later, his P-47 was caught by flak over Dieppe. A 20-millimeter shell exploded in the cockpit. The oxygen system failed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into his eyes. He tried to bail out, but the canopy was jammed shut. He was blind, burning, and losing altitude over enemy territory. A German Focke-Wulf pulled alongside and studied him. Then it opened fire, stitching holes across the fuselage. Johnson hunched behind his armor plate and kept flying. The German pilot could have finished him. Instead, he formed up on Johnson's wing and escorted the crippled Thunderbolt out over the channel. At 4,000 feet, he saluted and turned for home. Johnson nursed his bleeding airplane to an English airfield, landing with no brakes, no hydraulics, and 2 bullets embedded in his right leg. He kissed the ground and flew again the next day. But he understood now the war in the air was not a game. It was a battle of endurance where survival depended on the machine, the training, and the thin margin between luck and death. While the P-47 pilots of the 56th Fighter Group fought their duels over the Channel, the liberator groups of the 8th had been quietly deploying to North Africa for a strike of immense risk. On August 1, 1943, 178 B-24 liberators lifted off from North African runways, their target the oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania. The plan called for a low-level attack to evade radar, but confusion struck early. The lead navigator was killed when his plane crashed into the Mediterranean, taking the mission's bearings with him. Major Ramsay Potts, piloting a liberator named Duchess, watched the formation leader turn the wrong way over the Danube plain. Potts called out over the radio trying to correct the error, but the damage was done. The Armada flew directly over the heaviest flak concentrations in Romania. Ground fire ripped through the low-flying liberators with murderous precision. Potts saw planes on every side burst into flames, their wings sheared off by 88mm shells and balloon cables. Colonel Addison Baker's B-24, Hell's Wench, took a direct hit in the cockpit but held its course until it crashed in flames. Of the 178 aircraft that began the mission, only 33 were still fit for duty by the following day. For the men who made it back to Benghazi that night, the numbers told a brutal story. The 8th Air Force had lost more planes in a single mission than on any day before. Potts landed Duchess with 7 aircraft left from his original 15. The base was silent with grief. 2 weeks later, on August 17th, the 8th tried again. This time the target was the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg, deep inside Germany. General Curtis LeMay led the 3rd Bomb Division, and in the last slot of the formation flew the 100th Bomb Group. Major Jack Kidd sat in the co-pilot seat as command pilot for the 100th, with navigator Harry Crosby beside him. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Over Holland, the first wave of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts hit the formation from 12 o'clock high. Colonel Baron Ley, flying as an observer in Kidd's plane, described the scene as methodical slaughter. The German fighters attacked in coordinated waves, each pass tearing another B-17 out of the sky. Harry Crosby watched the last element of the low squadron vanish in a single explosion. Over the intercom, the tail gunner reported 60 parachutes in the air at once, men from both sides falling together. The 100th Bomb Group lost 9 of its 21 aircraft before reaching the target. Kidd kept the formation tight, his gunners firing until their barrels glowed, but every minute brought another plane spinning down in flames. When the survivors finally dropped their bombs on the Messerschmitt plant and turned south for Africa, Ley looked back and saw a column of smoke rising from the factory floor. The cost was staggering: 24 B-17s destroyed, 200 men missing. Kidd landed in Algeria with 7 planes left from his group. LeMay asked where the rest were. Kidd answered, "They were shot down, sir." October 14, 1943, would become known as Black Thursday. The target was Schweinfurt, the ball-bearing factories that kept the German war machine turning. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s into the heart of Germany. Colonel Archie Old, commanding the 45th Bomb Wing, flew in the lead plane of the 96th Bomb Group, a B-17F named Fertile Myrtle III. The plan called for P-47 escort to the German border. Then the bombers would fight through alone. The Luftwaffe rose in waves, 200 fighters strong. Old watched the first formations of Messerschmitts turn into the sun and begin their runs. The air filled with black flak bursts and the tracers of 100 machine guns. Fertile Myrtle III took a 20-millimeter shell in the nose that killed the lead navigator instantly. Old felt the blast throw him from his seat, his right wrist bleeding. Navigator Bob O'Hearn, flying in a borrowed B-17 from the 94th Group, watched his own plane lose engine after engine. When the bailout bell rang, O'Hearn threw himself through the forward hatch and floated down into a German field. He was captured within the hour. Of the 291 bombers that crossed into Germany, 60 never returned. 600 men were dead or captured. The bombers had proven they could reach any target, but the price was too high. The daylight doctrine that had brought the 8th this far now demanded a solution the bombers alone could not provide. The autumn of 1943 left the 8th Air Force reeling from the slaughter over Schweinfurt. 60 bombers gone in a single day. The crews knew the arithmetic. They could not survive a war fought this way. But the answer was already crossing the Atlantic. In December of that year, the first long-range P-51 Mustangs arrived in England. These were not like the short-legged P-47s that had to turn back at the German border. The Mustang, fitted with jettisonable drop tanks, could fly all the way to Berlin and back. At the same time, the first B-17Gs began appearing on the flight lines, their new chin turrets bristling with twin 50-caliber machine guns. The head-on attacks that had gutted the 100th over Regensburg would no longer go unanswered. The crew studied the new equipment with cautious hope. For Colonel Archie Old, now commanding the 45th Bomb Wing, the arrival of the Mustangs meant his bombers would no longer cross the German frontier alone. For Navigator Harry Crosby, back from Algeria with the remnants of the 100th Bomb Group at Thorpe Abbotts, it meant the odds were shifting. They had paid for this moment in blood, and now the price was about to be collected. On February 20th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. For 6 days, wave after wave of bombers struck at German aircraft factories, assembly plants, and airfields. The plan was simple: destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground and in the factories before it could destroy more bombers. Over 1,000 heavy bombers took part, and this time the Mustangs stayed with them. The German fighter force, already stretched by years of war, rose to meet the attack but found itself chopped to pieces. The Americans suffered heavy losses across the week, but the Luftwaffe lost nearly half its experienced pilots. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first serious daylight attack on Berlin. Nearly 600 bombers assembled over the North Sea, their contrails stitching the sky. The German capital was the most heavily defended target in the world. The flak over the city rose in black, churning curtains that seemed to swallow the formations. Yet the Mustangs were there, breaking up the fighter attacks before they could reach the bombers. The German pilots, many of them green replacements, were no match for the experienced Americans flying the sleek P-51s. Harry Crosby navigated a lead plane in the 100th Bomb Group formation that day. Looking out his window, he saw the smoke from Berlin rising to meet them, a dark pillar that stretched from the earth to 25,000 feet. The flak was everywhere, but the formation held tight. The bombers dropped their loads on the city's industrial districts and turned for home. Not every plane made it back. The Luftwaffe still had teeth, but the principle was proven. The daylight bombing campaign had reached the heart of the Reich and survived by the spring of 1944. The strategic landscape had changed. The Allied High Command was preparing for the invasion of Europe, the largest amphibious operation in history. The 8th Air Force received new orders. Strategic bombing of factories and oil plants would continue. But the primary mission was now tactical. Rail yards, coastal gun batteries, troop concentrations, and airfields across France and the Low Countries became the daily targets. The goal was to isolate the invasion beaches, to ensure that when the first soldiers hit the sand, the Luftwaffe could not interfere. The transition was not easy. Many crews had trained for deep penetration raids and now found themselves hitting marshalling yards within sight of the English coast. The flak over the French ports was still murderous, but morale lifted with the knowledge that the invasion was coming. Men who had flown through the hell of Regensburg and Schweinfurt now saw an end to the war. Archie Old, promoted to command the 45th Bomb Wing, briefed his crews on the importance of softening up the German defenses. Every bridge cut, every railroad switch destroyed, meant one less German soldier facing the infantry on D-Day. By the end of May 1944, the 8th Air Force was at full strength. Over 2,000 heavy bombers and nearly 1,000 fighters stood ready on airfields across southern England. The crews had been tempered in the fires of 1943. The equipment had been refined. The tactics had been proven. All that remained was the signal to go. On the evening of June 5th, the men gathered in their briefing rooms. The maps were still covered. Everyone knew what they would see. Normandy, the invasion had begun, and the mighty 8th would lead the way. June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway on the beaches of Normandy. Above the armada of ships and landing craft, the 8th Air Force deployed over 3,000 sorties that day. B-17s and B-24s hammered coastal gun batteries, troop concentrations, and communication hubs behind the beaches. Fighters swept the skies, ensuring the Luftwaffe could not interfere with the landings. The price was astonishingly low. Only 5 bombers were lost to enemy action out of the vast armada that darkened the French coast. For the men who had survived Schweinfurt and Regensburg, this felt like a war finally tilting in their favor. The tactical shift from deep strategic raids to close support had paid off. The weeks before D-Day had seen the 8th pounding rail yards, bridges, and airfields across northern France, isolating the invasion zone. When the first troops hit the sand, German reinforcements could not reach the beaches by rail or road. A B-17 pilot from the 45th Bomb Wing looked down and saw the fleet below stretching to the horizon. He later said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. For the first time in the war, the crews could see the direct result of their work in the smoke rising from the beach defenses they had just bombed. By autumn of 1944, the Allies had pushed deep into France, and the 8th returned to its strategic mission. The target was oil. On November 2nd, the 8th launched a massive raid on the synthetic fuel plants at Merseburg, deep inside Germany. The plants were vital to the German war effort. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe could not fly, and the panzers could not roll. But the Germans knew this too. The flak over Merseburg was the heaviest many crews had ever seen, and in the sky above the bombers, a new threat appeared. German Me-262 jet fighters, faster than anything the Americans flew, tore through the formations at speeds no bomber gunner could track. The bombers pressed on through the maelstrom. Me-262s struck without warning, their 30mm cannon shells punching through the aluminum skin of the fortresses with devastating effect. Fire spread faster than the crews could react. Bailout alarms sounded across the formation as aircraft fell from the sky in flames. The survivors who reached the ground fell into German hands nearly as quickly as they landed. 40 bombers were lost that day, but the synthetic fuel plants at Merseburg were heavily damaged. German oil production would never recover. The war in Europe ground on through the winter. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 saw the 8th flying in terrible weather to support the desperate ground battle. By spring, the German war machine was collapsing. On April 25, 1945, in the final week of the war in Europe, the 8th Air Force launched its last major strategic strike. The target was Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, deep in the Bavarian Alps. For the crews who had flown from England to Ploesti, from Schweinfurt to Berlin, this was the final punctuation mark on a campaign that had lasted nearly 3 years. The bombers dropped their loads on the complex. The raid was more symbolic than strategic. Hitler was already dead in his bunker in Berlin, and German forces were surrendering in droves. But for the men who had started the war in 1942 with a handful of B-17s, This was a moment of profound closure. When the last bomb fell, the strategic bombing campaign in Europe was over. The 8th Air Force had lost over 26,000 men killed, with tens of thousands more wounded or captured. The cost was staggering, but from the ruins of the Third Reich, a clear truth emerged. Daylight precision bombing, bought in blood over 3 years, had helped cripple the Nazi war machine. The story of the mighty Eighth is not one of machines, but of the men who flew them. Billy Southworth completed his combat tour but was later killed leading a B-29 squadron over Tokyo in 1945. John Schuler, haunted by his combat experience, left the service and became a noted abstract expressionist painter, channeling the skies he had navigated into his art. Bill Fleming recovered from his wounds and returned to Kentucky, living quietly as a coal miner and family man. Harry Crosby completed 37 missions, became a professor, and later published a memoir of his war years. Marshall Draper survived his capture and returned home, eventually writing about his experience as the 8th's first POW. Robert Johnson finished the war as a top ace, later joined the Air National Guard, and became a successful businessman. Bob O'Hearn endured 14 months as a prisoner of war, and upon liberation returned to civilian life, rarely speaking of his captivity. Ramsey Potts continued his Air Force career, rising to brigadier general before retiring to a career in law. Jack Kidd stayed in the service after the war, serving in various command roles before retiring as a colonel. Each of these men carried the war with them in different ways, but together they represented the thousands who had climbed into the aluminum tubes and flew into the heart of the darkness. Their legacy is not written in monuments. It is written in the peace that followed.